Paulo at the time. I had a professor who was actually one of the founders of the Center of Logic and Epistemology, Professor Porchat. And he told me, you know, it's going to be this coming week, an international conference at Clay. And I think you should go. So I went, right? And it was eye-opening. I loved the discussion, the way that things were conducted. Now I know there were some luminaries in epistemology at the time, which I barely knew. But it was at that moment that I said, interesting. I think I would like to be part of this larger community. Right? And then when I started my MA at the University of São Paulo, Professor Newton da Costa attended all seminars that Professor Newton da Costa offered. So one day, he's sort of kind of sick of me sitting there and bothering him with fashion. He said, "Oh, come on, why don't you do some proper work? You know, let's write a paper together, right?" And it was that way that I learned how to write papers. Right, you open up, several problems you think about, we discuss, and then the rest is history. So today I'll be talking about one of his interesting contributions to philosophical logic and philosophy of science, which is his theory of quasi-truth. And what I'll be going to do is basically to discuss some of the leading theories of truth, sort of classical theories, the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, the pragmatic theory, and the deflationary theory, right? And consider a couple of requirements that I think theories of truth, philosophical theories of truth, should meet, and seeing how well these theories fare with regard to these requirements, right? Then we're going to consider Newton da Costa's theory of quasi-truth, right? And see how it fares with regard to those requirements and the kind of shifts that it ended up proposing in the ways in which you may think about those kinds of theories of truth. And then very briefly at the end, I'm going to draw some connections between rationality and truth and the sort of implications that the theory of quasi-truth may have to these larger philosophical issues. Certainly we need, 3 times the time I have to do justice to all the things that I'm going to be talking about. So think about it today as an invitation for you to consider some of those issues. And then we'll hope to have some time at the end so we can talk about that. So I'll start, why exactly do we need a theory of truth, right? Of course, truth is a significant epistemic concept, right? Crucial for example, the conduction of inquiry, right? Where the goal of inquiry is sometimes taken to be true, to assert something when it's asserted, it's also typically taken to be true. To assess one's beliefs, also are usually taken to be true. So truth is central to a number of different activities that we engage with. But the question is, do we need a theory of truth in order to actually use the concept of truth in all of these contexts, right? And I think the answer is no, right? We really don't need it, right? Obviously, we need truth, well, perhaps, but certainly not a theory of that in order to perform those tasks. So then why bother with a theory of truth, right? So now, in this context, I think a philosophical theory of truth may help us identifying something about the nature and function of truth, whatever truth turns out to be, right? But we shouldn't expect from these theories more than they are actually able to deliver. Now, I'm an empiricist, which means that 3 times a week, I'm a skeptic. Now, Thursday, thanks, it's one of those skeptic days. So I'm going to start by offering a challenge to the very idea of developing such theories of truth, right? And it's a challenge that in a way points out about what might be thought as some misguided attempts to deal with truth philosophically within this context. So what's the challenge? Now, the question, it starts with the following question, right? Is it possible to understand the nature of truth in full generality? That is, without assuming that some truths are already understood, right? Then we start with a clean slate, right? Now, if some truths are assumed, that is, they are taken to be already understood, then an account of how these truths are understood is not provided, right? Because the account is just assumed, right, by whatever truth that you start with. And the resulting view is not fully general, right? The philosophical question asks us, can we understand what truth is without assuming any truth, right? So if we do that, if we assume some, then it's not fully general. On the other hand, if no truths are assumed as being already understood, and hence the proposal aims to define what truth is without invoking truth, the account itself cannot be taken to be true. For one cannot take the very formulation of truth the account provides as being true without assuming some concept of truth. And we end up in a circle. After all, the formulation in question was supposed to account for what truth is, and it simply begs the question to assume the very conception of truth that is being defined to understand the concept of truth invoke in its own formulation. So, I know this is a famous skeptical trope, right? Trying to offer us an account of something, you end up either with something that doesn't fully resolve the problem or end up in a fictitious principle and begging the question. So, understanding what truth is requires then a conception of truth. But by assumption, no such conception is assumed to begin with. Otherwise, generality is lost, right? So I think an argument along these lines should give us pause to think about to what extent should we even hope to provide a reductive account of truth. That is, an account that says, okay, this is what truth is, without assuming any truth in the background. Let me give an illustration, right? Consider the deflationary account of truth. I'm going to return to it in due course. Basically, it has the equivalent schema, sentence is true if and only if sentence in question. The question is the equivalent schema T true? Well, if it is, then either the schema is true according to the deflationary account or according to some other account. If the schema is true according to some other account, then the deflationary view fails to offer a complete account of truth, since it requires some other view in the background to account for its own truth. If, on the other hand, the schema is true according to the deflationary account, since the equivalent schema is supposed to characterize what truth is on the deflationary view, we end up reasoning in a circle, assuming as understood the very conception of truth that is supposed to explain what truth is. So this is just an illustration as to how the dilemma that I mentioned in the previous slide was worked out in a specific account of truth, right? And if this particular truth about the deflationary view is assumed as already understood, truth is not accounted for in general, right? And in either case, the account of truth, no account of truth with full generality is then required. Having said that, right? So this is my skeptical moment. All right. So let's now leave it aside for a moment and consider some of the accounts that do try to ignore these things and offer an answer to the question about what truth is and its nature, and see how they go. In order to do that, I'd like us to have some sort of a framework to think about these views, right? So I'm going to offer two requirements that I think reasonable accounts of truth should satisfy. So the first one we can call independence, right? What is true is typically independent of what one takes to be true. So we want the truth to be one thing out there, quite independently of what you believe or take to be so, right? So, what you hope for, wish, desire, expect, and all kinds of propositional attitudes had better be independent from what's actually true, right? Now, why should we need that? Well, we need the independence so that truth becomes an epistemic virtue, right? Rather than a pragmatic one, right? It tells us something about what is the case, independently of what we may take it to be. Now, the second one, accessibility, right? what makes something true according to whatever theory of truth in question should be accessible. That is, using the resources of the theory, one should be able to determine of something that it is true if it is true. Right? So you should be able to figure out, given how truth has been characterized, if something is indeed true, assuming that it is. Right? Now, if the accessibility requirement is not met, the relevant theory of truth becomes inapplicable, right? Because it's then unclear how to determine, according to the resources offered by the theory, what is true if it is, and what is not if it's not. Right? Note one thing, though, right? The accessibility requirement, it's not that a theory of truth should offer a criterion of truth, right? That's something quite separate. So the conditions under which something is true, as provided by a certain theory of truth, are different from what it takes to determine whether such conditions obtain or not. That's a criterion of truth, right? Rather, the accessibility requirement insists that however the theory specifies what truth is, if something is true, it should be possible to determine that this is the case according to the theory. So you think about it as a sort of an epistemological constraint on the kind of metaphysical theorizing about truth, right? Otherwise, it might be virtually impossible to apply the theory to any particular instance if you're not in a position to determine, according to the resources of the theory, whether something that is true is indeed so. Here's an illustration, right? If P is true, the statement P is true according to the correspondence theory, right? Then P corresponds to the fact that P. We're going to return to that account in a moment, right? The accessibility requirement would then state that in this case, we should be able to determine that P corresponds to the facts that P, right? That's what truth is according to the theory, so we should be able to determine that, right? So what the theory needs to provide is enough detail about what facts are, how can they be identified, distinguished with one another, so that you can then determine whether that relevant fact does obtain or not. Otherwise, you're not in a position to assert the truth in question according to the theory. Note that if you don't have a theory of truth, you don't have that kind of problem, right? Because just your problem is a lower end problem of figuring out whether something is true or not, and that's the problem with the criterion of truth. It's something different from the problem of the accessibility. All right, so let's go over some of those classical theories of truth and see what they say and how they fare with regard to these two criteria. So first, the correspondence theory basically tells us that truth involves a particular relation, correspondence, right, between suitable truth bearers, statements, propositions, utterance, whatever you take them to be, and some part of the world or some portion of reality, right? Now, the correspondence in question can vary quite different, widely, right? And each answer to the question, what kind of correspondence relation is, provides a different version of the correspondence theory, right? So, for example, we may think that the correspondence is a matter of copying, right? Connection between your truth bearers and the relevant portion of reality. Or it could be picturing, or representing, or mapping, or satisfying. All of those are correspondence relations. Each of them is different. So you actually have a family of non-equivalent fields associated with the correspondence theory. So the parts of reality in turn also vary widely, right? Because you need an account of what are those parts that are there, in the receiving end of the relation of correspondence. They could be, facts, state of affairs, situations, objects, properties, tropes, sets, sequences of objects, you name it. And so, again, depending on how the reality is carved and described, you get different answers to the question about what correspondence amounts to. So here, of course, you have a plethora of views. Imagine all the possible combinations that you can get right there. Right? Now, what they have in common is that they all supposed to satisfy a schema like this one, right? A statement is true if and only if it corresponds to the portion of reality P, right? So Now, how you spell out, how you offer instances of these, it depends on your favorite answer to the question of what the correspondence is and the relevant components, right? Statement P is true if and only if P copies the fact that P. That's one fact-based version of the theory. Statement is true if and only if P pictures the state of affairs, P, right? So picturing and state of affairs. Statement P is true if and only if P represents the objects having properties as in P, right? So those are all illustrations of how the versions of the correspondence theory can be worked out. Now, given this bare bones, right, of the theory, now how does it fare with regard to the two requirements that I mentioned, right? First, the independent one. What is true typically is independent, what one states to be true. I think this condition is very clearly satisfied by the correspondence theory, right? No matter how the correspondence relation is characterized, and whatever the relevant portions of reality are, both are independent of what one takes to be true. So I think that's unproblematic here, right? So consider, for example, right, the canonical version. Statement P is true if and only if it corresponds to the portion of reality P. The condition there holds independently of one's beliefs about what's true or not. So you secure the kind of independence requirement. How about accessibility, right? What makes something true according to the correspondence theory should be accessible. That is, using the resources of the theory, one should be able to determine of something that it is true. That something that is true, we should determine that it is true. Now, it's not so clear to me that this condition is satisfied, at least in general. Why? Because how can it be determined in general that P corresponds to the portion of reality that P? The theory requires that kind of generality, right? So, for example, let's focus in a moment on the correspondence relation as being one of representation, right? So the statement P may represent the objects having properties as in P, when in fact they fail to do so. So there might be a mismatch between what the description of the correspondence goes through and the intuitive truth collection at issue. Right? So consider, for example, cases of perceptual illusion. Right? Two parallel lines may be represented as having different lengths, when in fact their length is the same. Right? So you're all familiar with the sort of Müller-Lyer cases, right? Which are fairly stable. You may convince yourself that the lines, the two lines on the top have exactly the same length. You go there, you measure, and so on. And despite that, you look, and they still don't look the same, right? So there is a mismatch here between, what the theory describes as being the case and then what they actually turn out to be. So, another example. The first order axioms of piano arithmetic, right, may represent each natural number as having finitely many predecessors. When on a certain reading, non-standard natural numbers have infinitely many predecessors. So again, even though what's true, described as true to be so, is not properly captured or represented in this case. So there is a mismatch between what the theory requires and what's in fact accessible. So I have concerns on that second score. Okay, how about the coherence theory, right? According to the theory, then, truth is actually not a property in a way of individual sentences or statements, it's property of whole systems, right? We say roughly that a statement is true provided that it's part of a coherent system. But what is a coherent system, right? Well, it's coherent provided it satisfies some conditions. It's consistent, logically interconnected, so its parts are all mutually supported, it's explanatory, and it's empirically adequate. Now, the last condition of empirical adequacy is important here because otherwise, if you don't include it, right, it was not included in the original versions of the coherence theory, then there's no way of ruling out a consistent, logically interconnected, explanatory fiction, even though it's false, right? So consider, for example, Dostoevsky, The Gambler. Probably his most interesting and shortest novel. And he was actually working on a deadline. He was supposed to turn in a novel of a certain size by a ridiculously short deadline. Otherwise, you have to give away all his rights for everything he wrote up to that point and everything he writes for the future. So what he was doing, he was actually gambling with his own destiny, right? And he described beautifully in the novel the psychology of the compulsive gambler, right? And I think that novel actually, in a very coherent, explanatory, consistent, and illuminating way, describes what goes on in that psychology, even though none of the characters, none of the actual events described in the novel are true. So, so we need then that kind of the fourth requirement. On the other hand, I think we may complain about the requirement of consistency, right, as being too narrow, right? As we all know, the early formulation of the calculus, right, that introducing infinitesimals, were inconsistent, right? And it said you have magnitudes that are positive, right? So in a way they're different from zero, but they're smaller than any positive number, right? And because they're positive, they may be divided by an infinitesimal. And when by the end of a calculation we end up with an infinitesimal, well, because it's so small, it's smaller than any positive number, you treat it as zero and you just delete it, right? So that made, Berkeley, the analyst, crazy. So this is all incoherent, right? The whole thing is inconsistent. Despite that, the rules of the calculus, the differential integral calculus that Newton devised, is exactly right? Are the ones that we use today, right? So there's no question that the conception of the calculus that Newton had was coherent, but it was inconsistent. So we, right? Similarly, I think Frege's reconstruction of arithmetic in second-order logic with a basic law 5 turns out to be inconsistent. But there's no question that it is a coherent conception of arithmetic. So we better have a notion of coherence that doesn't rule out cases like that, right? And of course, as we all know, and provided the underlying logic is very consistent, right? Maybe don't need consistencies as a requirement here, but non-triviality would do just fine, right? So we can accommodate inconsistencies in ways that do not lead explosion. All right. How does the coherence theory then fares with regard to the two requirements? Remember independence, what's true is typically independent, what one takes to be true. So this condition seems to be satisfied on the coherence theory, right? Consistency or non-triviality, logical interconnections and empirical ethics obtained quite independently of what's taken to be true. Accessibility, on the other hand, it's less clear, right? Because it's unclear that this condition is ultimately satisfied. It's possible that a consistent, logically interconnected, explanatory, and empirically adequate system turns out just to be false, right? Consider, for example, non-relativistic quantum mechanics, right? Arguably, it satisfied all of these conditions imposed by coherence theory, but it's not clear that the theory is true, right? In fact, it's not even compatible with relativity. So there are issues about truth of the theory. So the idea here is, so what's the coherence theory requires, right, as being true doesn't seem to match what the grounds that we have accessibility to. All right. How about the pragmatic theory, right? So now this one, I'm going to consider the early versions of it. So Peirce had a sense of truth as something that will be eventually accepted at the end of inquiry. William James defended truth as what's ultimately useful, right? So in case you don't believe that that's what we say, here's just a quote. Well, Peirce says, truth is the opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed by all who investigate. So if you investigate in the end of the big scheme of things, eventually that's when you get to the end, you're going to get the truth. James says, in turn, truth is only the expedient, the useful in the way of our own thinking. So notice how different this is, right? Because now truth is radically epistemic, right? Truth is now understood as something that fundamentally depends on us. Process of inquiry depends on whatever is useful for us to think about. And this is a significant departure relative to all the accounts of truth we've been considering so far. They're mostly kind of metaphysical in nature. Now, what happens with the independence, right? Well, clearly independence requirement will be violated, right? So since truth is identified with what's ultimately agreed to by those who investigate, or with what is expedient in our thinking, there's no clear distinction between truth and what's taken to be truth in the long run. So that one goes to the window. How about accessibility, right? What makes something true, according to the pragmatic theory, should be accessible. Right? Now, the accessibility condition is clearly satisfied. That's actually one of the advantages of having an epistemic account, right? What's true is identified with those items which one has access to, right? Whether in the long run or because it's useful into one's thinking. So you lose one side, you gain in the other. Finally, the deflationary theory of truth. Probably one of the most, nowadays, the most common, widely accepted theories. In a way, it's actually an interesting theory because as opposed to all the theories we considered so far, it resists the whole point of a theory of truth, right? I said one of the things is to offer the nature of truth. Right? Deflationist theorists about truth says, well, truth has no nature. No, that's not the task of a theory of truth, to provide such an answer, right? Truth is basically understood as a kind of logical device that helps us to assent to content that's not being specified, right? Things like everything the Pope said is true, every sentence of the form A and A is true, and things of that sort, right? Now, the view is typically formulated by the equivalent schema that we saw a minute ago, right? Statement P is true if and only if P. Now, how about what happens with the independence requirement then? So what's true is typically independent of what one takes to be true. I think clearly this is satisfied by the deflationary theory, right? What's true is not constrained by what's taken to be true, right? It's not even, it doesn't even figure anywhere in the equivalent schema, right? In fact, the account specifies nothing about what's taken to be true, deliberately does that. How about the accessibility, right? What makes something true, according to the deflationary theory, should be accessible. Now, here I think the status is less clear. Why? Because the theory does not specify what makes something true. In fact, the theory is designed not to address this kind of issue, right? To determine whether one has access to what makes something true, when it's first an answer to the question of what does make so. And that's exactly what the theory said, that it resists making any pronouncements about. Now, note that to state that P is what makes true the statement to the effect that P is true, because that's what the theory says, this only provides an answer to this question once we know what P is. Right? And the theory, again, leaves that completely unaddressed. But this is precisely, right, what needs to be answering, precisely what the theory resists an answer to. So it's not part, they would say, the deflationary theorists would say, it's not part of a theory of truth not to settle this kind of issue. This is exactly why the view is minimalist. Just plug in whatever metaphysics you want, right? That's no longer the theory, part of the theory of truth. You just went elsewhere at that point. So as a result, I want to say that accessibility requirement is not properly addressed, right? Because there's no answer to that question. So finally, we're going to consider quasi-truth, right? Now, this was a proposal that Newton developed with Irene Mickenberg and Roland Strachey, right? Originally in a paper in the Journal of Symbolic Logic in '86. And one of the things that was meant to do was sort of capture some of the incompleteness, right, and partiality of information in the sciences, right? And one of the motivations of the view was originally to capture some aspects of the pragmatic theory of truth. And in fact, in that paper that I'm mentioning here, 86, the title refers to a pragmatic truth, right? That's how it was presented there. While being sensitive and responsive to the partiality of scientific information, right? Now, I think it's clear that scientific inquiry is typically contextual, right? Investigations are conducted in particular domains. They have their own suitable standards of evidence, and those things change. What is required to establish a result in pediatrics is very different from what's required to establish a result in particle physics, right? So the assessments of truth are made also in particular contexts, but relative to the information that's available and are accepted at that context. Now, so the account says, well, we can formalize and capture that feature by saying that part of the inquiry here involves establishing a particular pragmatic structure or a partial structure that has these three components, right? It has a domain of objects. These are the objects that are under investigation, right, or idealized as needed. It has also, a family of partial relations defined of these objects. These relations are partial because some of these relations are known to hold among the objects. Those are the R1 component of the relations. Some of those relations are known not to hold. These are the R2 components. And some relations are just open. We just don't know, given the available information, whether they hold or not, right? So note that this is an epistemic understanding of relations relative to what's known or not in the relevant accepted domain. Now, finally, this statements P is a set of statements that express whatever is accepted, taken as a background in the relevant domain D. Note that given a pragmatic partial structure, right, the one that encodes the partial information about a certain domain, there are many possible ways of extending that partial structure to a full one that in principle would settle all questions about the relations that is left open in the partial structure, right? We're going to call this full structure an anormal structure, right? Because it's tied to, given a partial structure, there are several several structures that extend the partial information to full, right? Those are the usual sort of Starskian structures, right? Then we can say when a sentence is quasi-true. So it's a sentence quasi-true or partially true. In a pragmatic structure A, if there is a full anormal structure, so a structure that extends the partiality of information, full information, in which the sentence in question is true in the Tarski sense that we are all familiar with. So basically, what a quasi-sentence does is it's consistent with the accepted information of the relevant domain, which is encoded in the pragmatic structure. And in this sense, nothing precludes the possibility of the sentence in question being true. Right? Since the available information about the domain in question is partial, it's encoded in the relevant pragmatic structure, and quasi-truth is assessed relative to the domain, we have a notion that accommodates partiality of information. That's exactly what it's designed to do. Right? Note also that quasi-truth is strictly weaker than truth. Right? A quasi-truth sentence may turn out to be false after all. Right? So this actually has an interesting feature, right? Because, for example, although Newtonian physics is not true, it is quasi-true, right? True in a particular context, right? Context, which context? Not subject to strong gravitational fields, the speeds of the objects are not very high relative to the speed of light, so the usual conditions in which classical physics would hold. So there is an interesting fact, because then we can look at all the plethora of past theories of science, and we say, look, maybe they're not true, but they are at least quasi-true. There's something about them that was appropriate given the domain in which they were operating. So that's the motivation behind the theory, right? How does it fare relative to the requirements that I mentioned, right? So first, independence, right? And I think it's clear that the status of the independence requirement in the theory of quasi-truth is quite interesting. Because on the one hand, what is quasi-true is independent of what is taken to be true. Right? Whether something is consistent or not with accepted sentences of a given domain is not dependent on what is taken to be true. Right? Consistency is an objective property of sets of statements. It's not up to us. Right? On the other hand, the consistency in question is relative to a set of accepted sentences, right? The sentences that constrain and specify the accepted information in the relevant domain. In this respect, quasi-truth is an epistemic notion, right? It expresses what is consistent with what is accepted in a given domain of inquiry. And here we got something quite interesting, right? Because the epistemic aspect here is inevitable, given one of the inspirations of the theory, which was, as I mentioned, accommodate the pragmatic theory of truth. So it tries to accommodate some aspect that was important for the pragmatic theory, the epistemic, right? But whereas the pragmatic theory, as we saw, is radically epistemic, it identifies truth with what is ultimately agreed up by all who investigate. We don't have that kind of identification in the case of quasi-truth. So it's strictly, I think it just finds exactly the right balance with epistemic consideration, right? We recognize the importance of those epistemic factors that helps with the motivation for pragmatic without going overboard, as the classical pragmatists did. It's a nice balance. How about accessibility, right? So what makes something quasi-true, according to the quasi-true theory, should be accessible, right? And indeed, it is, right? Because what takes for something to be quasi-true in a given partial structure is the availability of a full normal structure, which extends the partial information in the partial structure consistently with the accepted information in the structure's domain, right? And in which the relevant sentence turns out to be true. Now, we have access to all of that. And that's one of the attractions of the theory, because it's grounded on, as a good pragmatic theory is, on the practice, right, of scientists and the way that they engage with specific domains in specific contexts, right? So we have access to the information on the partial structure, the normal structure, the complete set, right, are all available in the relevant domain. Those, one has access, that makes something quasi-true. But what makes something quasi-true? And the accessibility requirement is met. So, quite interesting here, quasi-truth meets both requirements, right? The independence and accessibility. And in that way, it seems to fare better than the traditional accounts of truth. So, in case you want to, the checklist, here you go, right? The correspondence theory does well on the independence, not so well on the accessibility. The coherence theory does well in the independence, not so well with the accessibility. The pragmatic theory does not so well on the independence, a little better on the accessibility. And the deflationary, well in the independence, unclear about accessibility. And the quasi-truth, though, and one that actually manages both. Right? Now, you may say, well, that I was tendentious in setting this up. I tried to be as objective as I could, went over the theories, tried to offer the best shots and see what happened, right? What I think we're seeing here is something interesting. Now I can go back to my skeptical challenge in the beginning, right? What makes quasi-truth theory is, of course, there's a sense in which it's not a theory of truth, right? Strictly speaking, it's weaker than truth, right? But given the skeptical challenge I raised about whether we can even have such a theory of truth that does a kind of completeness, maybe that's not such a bad thing after all, right? So, but I do think, however, that it's a truth-like notion, even though it's not, strictly speaking, a theory of truth, right? Quasi-truth, right? And it's exactly because of that kind of malleability, right? Because it bears connections with consistency, bears connection with information about specific fields, and that's exactly the strength of the account that allows us to accommodate the partiality of information in the science. So if you manage to do well with the checklist, I think it's not by chance. And interesting also avoids the challenge that I started with, right? Of understanding truth in complete generality without assuming truth. That's not what the theory is in the business of. So let me conclude saying a few words about rationality. Right? Now, substantive rationality could be thought of as it's rational to believe P as long as there is evidence for it. That's it's substantial in the sense that you understand rationality on the basis of what kind of evidence is available to an agent, right? It's not a trivial task, right? But the question here is, well, what should we do, however, if we're dealing with inconsistent bits of information, right? When we have evidence that may be, in a sea of inconsistent bits. Remember the example I mentioned earlier about infinitesimals, right? In the original formulation of the calculus. So what should we do in cases like that? So to try to avoid that, some folks develop a weaker account. So, well, maybe you have a kind of a minimal understanding of rationality. Namely, it's rational to believe P for whatever P, provided that P is not inconsistent, right? Just avoid, as long as you're avoiding inconsistency, you're being rational, right? But I think this is both too weak and too strong, right? So it misses the mark on both counts. On the one hand, it's too strong because I think it may be rational to believe in inconsistencies, right? Again, considering infinitesimals in the early calculus, the fact that quantum mechanics and relativity are mutually inconsistent. I don't think physicists are irrational in exploring these theories any more than Newton was designing their calculus on an inconsistent setting, right? Also, I don't think the atheists are irrational, right? They believe in inconsistencies. If you have doubts, have a beer with Graham. And you see perfectly, straightforward rational calculus, right? So it would be too bad if your theories of rationality just settle, all of them as being irrational, right? Now, on the other hand, the minimal account is also too weak, right? Since rationality has no bearing on evidence. So then I think we lose the significance. So why should we care about rationality? If it's all about preserving evidence, preserving consistency, well, we need is just consistency, not rationality, right? What's interesting here, and that's where I close, I think Quasi-Truth offer an interesting alternative that I think has the best of both worlds here, right? Let's call it, pragmatic rationality, right? It's rational to believe P as long as there is some evidence for P, and P is quasi-true, right? So it follows that P may be inconsistent, right? But it need not be trivial. So everything follows. We can accommodate inconsistencies, right, without triviality, and it still preserve the rationality, right? So we can accommodate the rationality of the early formulation of the calculus, aspects of contemporary science, and our good friends, the nihilists. Not bad, all things considered. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Otávio. Right on spot, we have about 15 minutes for questions. I didn't see who raised the hands here, so let me start with Camilo and then.
Thank you. Hi.
I will also do this.
Thank you for the talk. I liked it a lot. I had some doubts about the accessibility requirements, in particular about whether it should be understood as a requirement or maybe perhaps as some kind of desideratum, bigger than requirement.
Okay.
Because there are theories, as for example, first order logic, which we take to be good theories, but we have undecidable arguments.
Yeah.
So it does not seem to be that for every theory it should decide every fact of the matter under its study.
Right.
In particular, it is not obvious to me that a theory of truth should be able to decide its own truth.
Right. Perfect. No, I'm sympathetic with your point. And we can think about the requirements as being desideratum. We can be a little weaker. I'm okay with that. My point is, in a way, an epistemological one, right? I think having a theory of truth that doesn't allow us to determine what's true according to the very standards of the theory, I think is something all things being considered, we should avoid, right? So that the theory becomes at least applicable, right? Now, it was a surprising result of our first order logic, the indecidability, right? So, and And then there are times to see whether we can do better on that score, right? Not surprising. So, but yeah, these are good ones.
Okay, I remember Eduardo and Kerian, but if you, everybody could raise their hands again, where to look at. Okay, so Eduardo.
Otávio, thank you very much for your talk. It was a very great, delightful birthday gift for me. Because the topic is something that I quite seriously take to heart. That said, then I would have a challenge actually. I feel that on the same vein you pointed out, your accessibility criteria actually adds something that you try to avoid if your independency criteria. It seems though that when you say this should be independent from our beliefs, then you're trying to search for a metaphysical kind of relation of truth. But then you said accessibility is a criteria. But I do think what you meant was that you shouldn't be able to get like a lot of indeterminate results that you don't know if that clear situation here satisfies the truth here or not. Then I absolutely agree with you. But correspondence series of truth seems to be able to do that. We just never are able to get evidence to believe that X is true or not. But that's entirely different game. In the second definition, you would not be able to satisfy independence in any way whatsoever because it would be in conflict.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Just one clarification. The idea would be for the independence is what is taken to be truth, right, should be independent of what truth is, right? Now, the accessibility, the idea is given the resources of the theory. So I'm not talking about what's true or false, right, out there in the world. I'm saying looking at what the theory says truth is, right? I should be able to use those resources to figure out whether, according to the standards of the theory, something that is true turns out to be so, or if something that is false turns out to be so. So it's weaker. It's not because otherwise, we would have there would be indeed a tension between the two, right? But the independence talks about what's truth, independent, what's taken to be so. And accessibility involves the resources of the theory, the specific resources. Right? That's why I separate that from the criterion of truth, right? Which is it's a separate issue, right? So think about it in the as a kind of an integration challenge, right? The way that Peacock raised, right? You expect that your metaphysics should jive with your epistemology. So if you introduce certain metaphysical notions, it's reasonable to expect that you should be able to say something about how we can know the truth about that realm of things, right? Of course, this doesn't mean that you need to be verificationist about what you do. That's a requirement that goes well overboard. But it seems reasonable, right? That some story be told about how we can judge what truth about the relevant subject. So in a way, the accessibility is similar in spirit to that kind of, which seems to be a sensible thing to ask. Maybe I'm showing here some of my empiricist colors, but maybe, it seems sensible. So, otherwise, again, we introduce something that has need not speak to any kind of access.
Okay, I remember three people on the line: Kerian, Juan, and Vincent. Maybe somebody else.
Thank you, so I have just two questions. The first one, I believe, is closest do you understand the notion of accessibility and your arguments against it?
Speak a little.
Your understanding, I believe that your understanding about the notion of accessibility and the way you use against the theory, correspondence theory, stuff is that you understand that notion like, or you have the access or not, instead of like a model property, something like you could have access in some great context. And all the examples you offer against the correspondence theory, it's safe in that case. Because, okay, in some good context, you can assess and determine. So, escape the problem of accessibility. And the second point is about the...
Let me just say one thing about that, right? The point would be, it's not that the correspondence theory theorist isn't able to say anything at all about the axis, right? There might be cases, specific cases, depending on how the notion of correspondence is worked out, what the relevant portions of the world are invoked, that we may have no problem figuring that out. The question is, can we guarantee that that's the case in general, right, for all the possible combinations? That's where my worry is.
Yeah. And the second question is about the Quasi-Truth theory. And when you have the triangle, the domain, the relations, the partial relations, and the set of propositions that you accept to be true, right? That's a point. That's just set, right? What does that mean to be accepted?
Good.
If you understand that's like some kind of pragmatic position about what is accepted, you put again the problem about independence in the back door of your theory, because you're saying now, well, I have some propositions here that to be preserved in the total structures, right? That's the B set. And what the propositions that I choose to be inside that set, it's I accept that proposition because I am having a background, a pragmatic theory of truth. But now you put the problem of independence.
Right, good. Yeah, I think the idea there is the following. You build up in stages, right? Scientific practice is constructed in a way that research is never in a vacuum, right? It's conducted by sharing some assumptions that typically are assumptions that rule how researchers in that field are going to collect evidence, assess evidence, interpret experiments, and so on. All of those are part of what it takes to investigate in that specific field, right? This is part of whatever is accepted, right, in that field. Now, we haven't talked about truth yet, right? So, of course, you may say, look, like, how do you get to those things? You get them because you take them to be true, right? Of course, I think that the Quasi-Truth theorist says, well, you don't need truth, right? In part because norms weaker than truth are, on this view, are operating in the science. In fact, if we have stronger norms, that's where we run into trouble. So think about it as part of what constitutes research in a particular subfield. Right?
But every proposition inside the B set in the total structure needs to be true. Cannot be false, quasi-false.
Yeah.
So we were accepting the notion, some kind of notion of truth.
But think you can accept something without taking it to be true, right? So, for example, you may send a rocket to the moon, just accepting Newtonian physics. Not only you don't take it to be true, you don't even think it is true, right? But it's good enough for the calculations that you have at hand, so you accept it. Accepting here is a pragmatic notion in the sense of not a pragmatic theory of truth, but pragmatic in the sense of you use those theories for explanatory predictive purposes, quite independently of taking the theories in question to be true. So it's pragmatic in that sense. He talks about the use of the expression. We can talk more.
Your time is over. We have still 5 minutes. Juan, Vincent, and Daniele.
Okay.
Yes.
So this kind of subject always get me confused. By the way, I'm not a philosopher, so and perhaps my question is the same as his, but isn't independence and accessibility incompatible?
Right. I hope so. I hope that not, right? So, because the independence, it's a claim about what's taken to be true, right?
What do we mean by taken?
So it's considered, right, or believed, or assumed, hoped, whatever propositional attitude you may develop, right? And so the idea is what is true is independent of what is believed or expected to be true. That's independence, right? Note that here I haven't specified what truth is, right? But the idea is whatever it is, it should be independent of those components. Now, accessibility has to do with the resources of the particular theory of truth in question. What needs to be accessible is, so for example, if a theory says the truth is correspondence, we need to then specify what kind of correspondence it is, and we need to have enough details about what counts as that particular correspondence to be able to determine whether what's taken to be true or whether it's true or whatever is indeed so according to the theory. Right? The accessibility is the resources that the theory provides. So, for example, a theory is corresponding to the facts if it represents the facts, as they are. Right? So then we need a notion of representation, a notion of facts that allow us to settle, okay, for this particular claim, what are here are the facts, this is how they are being represented, so we can determine why indeed what.
It's in some sense a kind of computability. I mean, I can determine.
Yeah, you can
once
use the theory to have an answer.
Once I have the facts.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right? So, and that's why it's it doesn't clash with independence, but that's a claim about the resources of the theory.
Okay.
Okay, so Vincent, please.
Hi, thank you. This bit about something's way like has a model, but not way like this makes me think about intuition state. Is there like a motivation philosophical?
Yeah, there are all kinds, yes. In fact, one of the reasons why this initially was called pragmatic truth because of the inspiration of the pragmatists. Then later on became clear that this is actually a broader framework, right? And depending on how we interpret the various connectives and the resources of the theory, you can actually get very different philosophical interpretations. So yes, there are connections with Jaskowski, discursive logics. There are a number of interesting work. And here declared, Cornelius and Italy, they've been doing a lot of interesting work exploring the various logics associated with that. But they have their own accounts. You need to watch out. It's slightly different. It's very good too. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can take just one more question, please.
Very briefly. Can you illustrate again why visual illusions are a counterexample or a problem for the correspondence
The
theory?
correspondence.
Yeah, because I share the worry of some of the other questions that there's being a bit of a match between certainty and truth. Like it's clear that you want to distinguish these two things, but then in the visual illusion case, it's not so clear to me how we're not talking about certainty.
Well, I didn't even use the notion of certainty, so I'm a little surprised why certainty is coming up.
Verification. We used, I think it was your point earlier that it says metaphysical, we were looking for a metaphysical notion of correspondence. You said, yeah, but the sort of verification that I'm talking about, is a verification internal to the theory, not external to the theory. Right?
Yeah, right. So the theory says, the facts are represented
Yes.
as being so and so, right? And they may be represented as being so and so, when in fact they are not so and so. So there is then a mismatch.
So I could be mistaken, and the
That's
two
right.
lines are the same.
That's right.
Yeah, but
So-
that's me not being certain.
Well, it's not about certainty,
Right.
right?
It looks like it.
Well, no, it's not. Certainty is something very different, right? Because the question is, the theory says, look, this is true,
Yes.
right? And it turns out that it's not,
Yes.
right?
So the theory is wrong.
Yeah, so that's the worry, right? That's because guided by the resources of the theory, we led to an answer that actually,
But if it were true, the lines would be equal.
that's
So
right.
there would be a correspondence.
Yeah, that's the idea. So there is a mismatch.
So thanks, everybody. Otávio,